Hi, I'm Justin Rothshank, and I'm here to invite you to the 12th Annual Michiana Pottery Tour, happening on September 23 and 24 in northern Indiana and southern Michigan. You'll find a list of the more than 50 participating artists, links to their web stores, and more information at www.michianapotterytour.com or on our Instagram page at Michiana Pottery Tour. Michiana Pottery Tour is a program of the new Northern Indiana Clay Alliance. We hope to see you this fall.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 479 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Glenn Barkley about his new book, Ceramics: An Atlas of Forms. He chose 113 objects in the collections of major Australian and New Zealand museums to establish a broad survey of ceramic history. In our interview, we talk about his research process and how he discovered the unique stories that these objects hold. If you would like to find out more about Glenn's career, both as a maker and a curator, you can listen back to episode 227 of this podcast, where we go into depth about those topics. If you'd like to purchase the book, it's available now in Australia through Thames and Hudson. You can also find it through their website. It will be widely released in the U.S. in March of this year, and you can pre-order it now on Amazon or at your favorite bookstore. If you'd like to follow what Glenn has going on in the studio, you can check him out on Instagram. That's Glenn Barkley. I wanted to take a minute and thank the folks that donated or purchased a piece in support of the Brickyard Network last week. Through our auction, we raised a little over $3,000 to support our programming at the Archie Bray Foundation. We continue to welcome donations throughout the year, so if you'd like to donate and you hear this in the future, just go to archiebray.org and search for the Join and Give button. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview.
I'm a little bit late for two reasons. Is one, like most ceramicists, if you get them together, they'll probably just talk about their kilns or ventilation or something really boring and banal. Anyway, we just had a new ventilation system put into our new kiln, and I had to go in early and just check whether it had worked or not, and it did. So that's really good. The second thing is between my house and the studio used to be the biggest ceramic production factory in Sydney. So they used to make sewer pipes, chimney pipes, crocks, industrial wear, but the waster tip is in the oval, in the sporting ground. So I get a bit caught up. It's been raining, and I go and I look on the ground and I find tiny pieces of ceramic that I've been collecting. Yeah.
Wow, in the oval.
It's on the ground in the dirt. I have to dig in the dirt and look for tiny pieces, but I found some bigger pieces as well. I was told last week that it's illegal, but we'll see how we go.
Yeah. Well, I love this idea of the story of place of, okay, it's industrial and pre-colonial, it was probably indigenous land, then colonial land, and then eventually industrial land, and then sport land. It's this idea that land is this multi-purpose thing over time and people, really.
Yeah, there's this great Australian author who you may not have heard of, a guy called Norris Ainu, who's in Adelaide. He has written a really great book about Australian vernacular art. And one of the chapters is about what are called brickies pots or foreign orders. So pots that were made in factories by the people that worked there. And they were quite often made at the end of the day, or they were gifts for them to each other, for their families. So they'd make them and put them in the bottom of the kiln. Anyway, he talks about how we seem to have forgotten how ceramics and the production of ceramics has actually shaped our cities, because brick pits in Sydney, Indigenous people used clay. When the colonisers came, they adapted some of those sources, and then as the city grows, the brick pit moves out with the city. So if you sort of track the city, there's two things that you'll always find on the edge of the town. One is a brick pit and one is a cemetery. And the two things are actually intrinsically linked. And so the brick pits that we're here, where I live in Sydney, and people in Sydney are obsessed with real estate. I live in quite a sort of gentrified suburb, but if I walk 2 minutes sort of south, I'm actually standing in what was the brick pit. But most people don't know that. There's this dip in the land, but it's actually, that's where the clay was excavated from. And so I love it that there's this sort of, where I live, there's this ceramic history sort of outside my door.
Oh, man. Well, I'm actually coincidentally researching brick making in Montana, because the parent company of the podcast network that I'm on is in Montana, and it's there on a former industrial brick site. And essentially, back in our history of people moving west and pushing Indigenous people out of their land, I mean, it's so interesting, the parallels between U.S. and Australian expansion and progress, quote unquote, and how that was really pushing Indigenous people out. But also bricks were the way that people made permanent their settlements.
Exactly. Yeah.
In Montana, we now have the Archie Bray Foundation that is from this exact history, which is now an amazing art center. But we don't think about that part of the history. Who was there before?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, we're talking about my book today, and it's really important to me that there's a lot of Indigenous artists in the book, because it's this really distinctive thing about Australian ceramics that is very visible, and it's quite an important thing. And it's the last work that I actually is included in the book is a work by Dean Cross, which actually includes unfired clay, which some people will say, well, that's not ceramic. But I think that idea of actually expanding our ideas about what ceramic is, that sort of, for me, as an Australian maker, it comes from Indigenous art. It breaks a lot of boundaries. And it also, I think Indigenous people have this idea about every when, which is this idea that time isn't linear. It's actually almost circular or shaped like a spiral, which I actually find such an intriguing idea that I sort of keep it in my sort of heart and my thinking when I'm looking at ceramics, because I think all ceramicists love that you can look at a pot from 5,000 years ago and actually see the potter. Like, you talk to ceramicists and it's something it's sort of a bit of a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, because it's true.
Yeah, and I think also the sense experience of touching clay is so built into our DNA. If you get it, like if you're obsessed with clay, that feeling of clay on your skin is so profound that I think it also affects everything. You know, like, because you'll see potters in other art studios picking up everything. Like, you can't keep a potter from picking up a piece of art.
That they are the worst. And I've just curated a show at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and I was there with quite a well-known potter. Well, I can say who it was, Pip Drysdale, who some of your listeners might know. And Pip reached out and grabbed one of the works. It was quite amazing, because you can't stop. There's a certain point you just got to let it go. The guard didn't like it much, but potters are the worst touches of all time. They tap stuff. They want to pick it up and look at the bottom. It's like, just cool it.
So I wanted to, if you'll indulge me, I wanted to jump into the process of writing the book. I'm an author as well, so I like to hear about other people's process. And with this book, it functions on two levels. It's a history of objects, but it's also a history of collections. And I had no idea about how Australian collections were formed. And you spend actually a pretty good amount of time on some of the earlier objects talking about how they got to Australia. So can you talk about how Australian collections were formed?
Maybe just sort of go back to the first part of your question about how the book
Mm-hmm.
came about and how I sort of came up with this idea of using Australian and New Zealand collections. Thames and Hudson, who published the book, quite a big major publishing operation. And originally there was talk about working with a major overseas institution who have an expansive ceramic collection to base the book around. And I met with them, and there was something, I'm going to say, I didn't sort of like about their attitude. And in some ways, working with a big institution that has everything, you could get stuck because it's like, what do you choose? Because you can choose sort of anything. And then so then after that trip overseas, I came back and I thought, no, you know what? I think it's Australian and New Zealand collections is where the interest might lie, and actually to use the limitations of those collections as a strength rather than as a perceived weakness. That actually the reason why objects have ended up here is quite often a really fascinating global story. I also think the other thing is that most global history of ceramics are written from the perspective of the UK and Europe more broadly. So they look in a particular way. Like, I hate to say it, but English people and Europeans think they are the center of the universe because that's what colonization does. And that as a consequence, they sort of sucked everything into their vortex, all of these objects. And so they write these histories which centers themselves and quite often the places and the pottery that they look at. It's about their relationships as colonizers with those cultures, which is sort of interesting way to structure the book in Australia, because it sort of really made me think about, what have Australian museums collected that are different, and what are objects that are in Australia that actually tell you something about Australia's place in the Pacific as well. So there is an emphasis on Pacific potters because most of those global histories, they don't include Pacific pottery at all. Like, it's just completely absent, which I find really strange. And so through that process, I sort of knew there were certain things that I wanted to include in the book, which I just think are such sort of objects that tell a really fascinating historical story, but are so tied up in Australian history and Australian colonial history in particular. So, for instance, the Wedgwood medallion, which is in the book, the Sydney Cove medallion. I mean, most people outside of Australia don't know about that object, but it is so fascinating that it's this thing that was made from clay that was from stolen Indigenous land, sent back to the UK in basically the first month or so of European colonisation of Sydney Harbour, and what that tells you about the world at that time. And the same with the Sydney Punch Bowl, which is this mysterious object which was made in China by someone in Sydney commissioned it, or someone in England commissioned it, and it's unclear who was the commissioner. It's never been able to be quite worked out. And there's two of them that exist. But this sort of melange of sort of European activity in China, this new colony in Australia, and these sort of beautiful makers in China making these beautiful ceramic bowls, I just think that is such an incredible story. I like stories. Yeah. I go for the story every time.
In terms of research, what's interesting to me is that you have a massive swath of history. So it goes from what is the earliest, 3500 BC?
Yeah, well, I have the book right here, Ben. I can tell you. It's like, I don't know, you probably worked on things yourself, and it's like once you do it, it's like, a lot of stuff. I had to push stuff out of my brain to get new stuff in. Yeah, it's 3500 BCE.
And that's the
Which is an Egyptian, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. So you've got that, and then you've got all these different sort of segments of time leading up till today. But then in the course of this book, I was just thinking like how many hours you must have spent trying to find the most compelling stories about the most compelling objects. Because sometimes you find a compelling objects in the collection that because of its circumstances of being collected, there's just no information. Like it just says nothing. So how did you get to the story of all of these pieces?
I suppose there were about 50 things that maybe chose themselves, if you get what I mean. And there was also like I have a particular interest in certain things as well. So I don't think, apart from there's a work from the Memphis group, which is made in sort of the 1980s, but I would say that's the only piece that you could say is design, like a designer working with ceramics. Most of the things are either made by an individual or a group of individuals rather than a sort of design process. So that is one bias that's there. And I'm also really drawn to tactile sort of making, very hands-on, and I'll always go for the rough and ready over the highly finished. And I think that sort of defined what I was choosing as well. And there were other objects that I wanted to include that actually it just became too unclear what the story might be or what that object might be. So I had to leave them out. Most of the texts are between 300 to 500 words, which I've always said that's enough room to say something, but not enough space to make a clanger of a mistake. Because I think, I find it difficult. Anyone who's written something, you go through this editing process, you get it out there, and you just like fingers crossed. Yeah. Because you never know what's going to happen. And there are a couple of things in there where I actually questioned, like, what people thought it was in their institutional information. I was like, not quite sure that's what it is, but I'll try and come up with a way of talking about it which is a bit ambiguous, which doesn't tie anyone into a meaning or a conclusion.
Part of the writing style is that you'll have these snippets, the 300 to 500 words about the object, but then you'll pull out words like, let's say the pot had cobalt on it, and you'll pull out a word like cobalt, and it's almost like a search function on a computer where you'll like tell people what cobalt is. Why did you think it was important for the book to function almost like an encyclopedia of material, of ceramic material?
I think that is, well, look, I'm not going to claim that. That was actually the people that I worked with at Thames and Hudson and the editor that I worked with. They pulled out a lot of those words, but I've always said I wanted this book to be for a general audience, and actually think ceramicists, look, if you and I get together with a bunch of other ceramists, we're going to talk in a language that if someone from outside listens in, they're going to say, like, what's wrong with those people? But I think you need to sort of give clues for the general reader. Yeah, because they're very simple descriptions as well. They're not overly, they're not huge, long definitions. It's just a sentence which sort of tells you what that is. I don't think you can make assumptions that people will understand all those terms. And so I think it works really well, actually, for the general public. And the other thing, which is interesting because it was something I wasn't totally sure about, is the glossary is at the start rather than at the end. And a lot of the feedback that is coming back from the buyers and from the distributors is that's the feedback they're getting, is that everyone thinks that's really good. Whereas I was always like, oh, why is that at the front? Like, let's move it. But it's good to be proven wrong.
Well, there's so many parts of the book that remind me of the modern internet because there's things linking to other ideas. So say, for instance, when you have the pop out about cobalt, in my mind, that's almost like clicking a link that takes you to what cobalt is. And I think, surprisingly, that I think is going to appeal to people that are my 40s and above because they'll remember encyclopedias. But then it also appeals to people that are like 25 and below because they're used to reading on a phone where they click links and go on to find out the next thing.
I'm glad you've seen that, like it's one of those things that it was just there the whole time and you don't sort of realize that it's there. And then when the book comes, and then it's good to get feedback because it's like, oh, well, that's good that it works. But also the idea of if you read one of those texts, then there's also links on the column to the left of other pots that are in the book that you can look at.
Yeah. So there's 100, is it 110? How many objects in the book?
I think there's 113, but I could be wrong. Yeah. It's something like, I think it's over 110.
Which is a lot. So we're not going to be able to jump into all of them, but I did want to kind of cherry pick a few that I thought told
definitely
interesting stories. And actually, we'll start with that one in the very beginning from 3500. And that's actually pre-dynastic Egypt. You picked a pot that actually was about trade. I think there's boats that are on the surface of that.
That's true, yeah. Yeah.
You give this explanation of the way that this system of taking antiquities out of the ground in Egypt and shipping them globally worked. And I think there was a fund called the Egyptian Exploration Fund. Can you just explain like how this all worked? Because I knew nothing about this.
So the Egyptian Exploration Fund, and just sort of as a summary of it, is that it was a fund that people globally could subscribe to. And it was based in the UK, and it was to fund predominantly English archaeologists working in Egypt around the sort of middle and late of the 1800s. So probably the central person is Flinders Petrie, who is this really important archaeologist who was working on it. And so what would happen is people would subscribe to that fund and institutions would subscribe to that fund. So in Australia, for instance, the Melbourne Library subscribed, the Australian Museum subscribed, but then there were just individuals who subscribed. So you could put money in, and then as they found things, they would, I'm assuming, would keep the best things for themselves and then distribute the other material out to their subscribers. Probably depending, you would get the equivalent amount according to how much you subscribed. And so that's how this Egypt material sort of was distributed throughout the world. But one of the key places that they dug was in a place called Diospolis Parva, which is a pre-dynastic necropolis. And in terms of ceramic history, and quite fortunate, it's this place where Flinders Petrie came up with this typology of pottery and innovation, which allowed him to almost create a chronology in pre-dynastic Egypt. And we're really lucky here in Sydney in that the Chow Chak Wing Museum, which is at the University of Sydney, actually has a really good display around Petrie's typology. And they actually have a large number of these vessels that have come from the Egyptian Exploration Fund. So funnily enough, over time, a lot of that material has ended up in museums. So quite often the sort of individual subscribers have donated their material to different museums. So the Australian Museum has things, the Chow Chak Wing has material as well. But there's also material in Brisbane, there's material in Adelaide. So that material is distributed all across Australia. But it's a great place to start because I think when people go and look at those pots, they're quite simple to look at. They're really... I find them quite dynamic, and I've actually been doing a body of work myself around those pots. But they have quite often minimal decoration. They're really simple shapes. They're thrown on a wheel, but they're just so beautiful. And I've been lucky enough to handle some of them as well. And it's like I said, the person that made it is right there. They're like, you're in the room with them when you touch those pots. But there is something maybe problematic about how they ended up here. And I would question whether that would happen today. But so I have heard that the Egyptian government has an opinion that those collections of Egyptology, it's actually a really good branding exercise for tourists because it's like, I want to go to Egypt. And the reason why I want to go to Egypt is because I've seen all these beautiful Egyptian objects.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I was listening to an interview you did with a podcast called Artwank, which I think is a hilarious name for a podcast. But you were talking about that, how Egypt, how essentially these objects become billboards that educate people about Egypt. When you walk into a museum, I think we all fantasize about where these pots are from, what the people were like, what their environment was like. And I think the book does a really good job of giving us little hints like, oh yeah, in Egypt, this was happening. In Nigeria, later when you show a Ladi Kwali pot, you talk about what her life was like. So I think there's like little snippets, you're giving my brain something to latch onto, which is what I like.
Oh, good. And I will just sort of say too, the other thing with the book, and the thing that I always said is the key to the book is the pictures. The pictures had to be really big. I think, Ben, you've looked at the digital copy, but in the hard copy, it's quite, the pictures are like, it takes up a whole page. And I really worked with a great designer, Claire Orrell, but I was always like, make it bigger. That was the only thing I would say. Do you know that famous George Lucas direction was faster, more intense? It was just, I would just say, yeah, make it bigger. Because I'm a maker. Yeah. Actually want to see the pot. Yeah. And there's images that I've chosen for the book where I think that's because I'm a maker. Yeah. That's why I want that image there, because you can see the faults, or you can see the way something's cracked, or the way that something's breaking, like a glaze is breaking, or the way the rim is made. That was all about me as, what do I want to see as a maker? And quite often it's not what a curator wants to see. It's a different type of information.
Yeah, and there's a great example of that. The best pot, which I don't know if I'm saying the name, it was a god. This is fast forwarding to, it's funny to say fast forwarding to 1900 BCE. But there's this pot that has the most simple face I've maybe ever seen on a pot. Like, it's just 3 pieces of clay that are smushed onto the side that make a face. And it's such a clay pot. Like, it's fired, but it looks as if it is still wet. Like, it has that immediacy that we love, that potters are into.
And look, that pot it's sort of like you see a pot like that and it's undeniable. It's so fresh, and that just looks like it was made yesterday, but it looks really fast. Like, it's like someone's thrown that and made that in minutes, and then the face and everything, it's just sort of dabbed on there as quick as can be, but it's sort of perfect.
You do chronology, like you're in a traditional sense when you're reading the book and flipping pages. You're going from the past into the present, but you're often jumping over large gaps of time. So how did you decide like what your sections were going to be in terms of like, there's some, so for instance, there's a category that's the year 2000 forward, which is interesting because I don't think of that as a historical time period, but it makes sense as one. So talk to me about how you section the book out.
Then it's really funny because you're finding these things where I'm like, I don't know why that's like that. I think it is, again, it's a design feature, a way of just sort of containing information into these sort of chapters that make it a little bit more palatable, just easier to digest as much as anything else. And it's a way of just breaking up the rhythm of the book. Quite often, I think the trick with making a book, and an art book in particular, it's like thinking about the book as a artwork in itself, and it having a rhythm as you work through it. Like, and you just got to find that rhythm. And the chronology works really well, but actually breaking it up just makes it a bit easier and just gives you a space to breathe before you get into the next thing. I'm someone who really loves I really love books. I can't believe I've got this gigantic book. Like, it's really heavy. And I gave it to my mum, one of the people I've dedicated to, and she could barely lift it. And it's like, oh yeah, it's success, having a heavy book. But some of the books that I really love are photography books like Robert Frank's The Americans and Walker Evans' Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And that whole thing about the sequencing of those books is really important. And so I wanted it to have that feeling too, like it's a sort of journey in a sequence, but it's put together with these spaces where you can stop before you come to the next part.
It's funny you mentioned the weight of it, because when I think of Thames and Hudson as a publisher, they only make heavy books.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
When I was in undergrad, we had some of the books for our art history course, and I automatically thought heavy book means important material.
Yeah.
So you've really made it. You picked the right publisher for that.
I also wanted to make a book that, the book has got this orange cover. I wanted to make a book that someone could buy, and I think the price point is about right. Because $80, 80 Australian dollars, and I think it's the sort of book that I wanted ceramicists to buy and have it kicking around their studio, and it would get scuffed up and it would get dirty, but you'd be like, it's in the orange book. Do you know? It's that pot that's in the orange book. It's in Glenn's book or whatever. Like, I wanted it to be something that is used, and the idea that might happen sort of fills me with joy. Yeah, that's how I want the book. I don't want it. Yeah. By all means, buy 2 copies, one to keep pristine, but the other one, I like the idea of artists having it in their studios.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Like I said, we won't be able to go through all of them, but there were a couple other people I wanted to talk about, and one of which is Margaret Dodd, who was educated in the U.S., and was part of the funk movement, California funk movement, and was a student of Arneson's. So can you talk about her and what her contribution to Australian ceramics is?
I think Margaret's it's sort of hard to understate her importance. I think that Margaret, she probably suffered a little bit in the American context because she left maybe before it really became funk became the phenomena that it became. So I think she was telling me that there was quite a famous exhibition called, I think it was just called Funk, which is maybe in the mid-70s that happened, that toured around Australia. And I'm sure your listeners know, you can find out what that was called and when it was done. But she left basically as that show was being put together. And the curator, I think, had a sort of rule that you had to be living in California or be part of it. You had to actually be in the States. And so the fact that she left meant that she was excluded from this major survey, because I think Margaret's work stands with Arneson's. I think it's really great work. And then Margaret went on to make a really important Australian art film called This Woman Is Not a Car. And I've always thought it's a really great parallel with Kennedy Miller's Mad Max movies, because it's like this. Those Mad Max films are very much about the fetishization of cars, and Margaret's but they're very masculine. They're about toxic masculinity if they're about anything, whereas Margaret's is taking this much more feminist and nuanced look at the car, and the car is that the sort of negative outcomes of that toxic masculinity, but also about motherhood and the vehicle as a place where people can escape. So it's such an important film in Australian film history. And so parallel to that film, Margaret's still making ceramics, and she's still making ceramics to this day. And I think she is someone who over time, I think, will become more and more important to younger makers, because I think she makes the kind of work that younger makers are really interested in. It's sculptural, it's not functional, it's speaking about these very real concerns about marginalization and about women. And I think that she was one of the people that was chosen for the book before the book even existed, before it was even an idea. Margaret was in the book. Yeah. Because I think the other thing about this book too, I'm very aware of the fact that, and look, I'm very sort of, do I have pride? Is it pride or proud? I'm not sure what the right word is, but I want to make people in other countries be aware of how good Australian ceramics practice is, because I believe in it. And I think it is really good. And I think it's as good as anything anywhere. Yeah. And Margaret's someone that her work, in some ways, it's very Australian, but it's also anchored in that funk movement. And I want people in America to think, oh, yeah, here's this person that we never heard about, but they could be central to the telling of that story.
Yeah, and I think for me as an American reading it, I was like, wait, there's someone that I missed just altogether. Because I know funk, I know Arneson. I mean, the reality of the funk movement is even in high school ceramic classes, people see that Arneson bust. Or there's many of them, but there's some really famous ones that literally everyone sees. But I'd never seen the piece that's a piece of a car, Hudson. I can't remember what the name of that car is, but it was a car that has hair that's like sculpted onto it.
Oh yeah, Holden with hair curlers.
Holden, that's what it is. Yeah. And one of the things I love about it is it is so funk and that it's so physical. The hair curlers, it's another, you can feel that connection to the maker because I can see the fork going through the clay making the hair. You know what I mean?
So good.
So good.
Yeah. And then I'll tell you also, as that could be of interest to sort of American listeners as well, is Margaret has always used a particular type of American glaze. I won't use the company's name, but she is a firm believer in their older glazes that have lead in them. And so she actually has this incredible archive of their glazes that she's collected for 40 years. Yeah.
Oh,
so
wow.
Her material, that came out of her working in California. She actually found the materials that she stayed with the whole time, and she sort of hoarded them all. Yeah. Which is then another potter in Australia used them and then they stopped. So she bought her supply. Like she actually sort of coveted all that material, those leaded glazes. But I do know another American potter who also collects those leaded glazes and swears by them. I think there's this really interesting story that hasn't been told about the links between ceramic production from the 60s and the 70s and conceptual practice. Because Margaret told me this amazing story is Bruce Nauman used to be there at Davis. He was part of that ceramic course because I think it became this place where sort of anything went. Yeah. And in Australia, the sort of leading conceptual movement, which was centered around this place called the Experimental Art Foundation in Adelaide, shared a building with the Jam Factory, which is one of the sort of still existing craft centers in Australia. So Margaret's this sort of bridge between ceramics and conceptualism as well, that's a story that needs to be unpicked. Someone should do that. Yeah. If someone's listening, there's a PhD for free.
Well, there were two sort of, I don't want to call them colonial outreach programs, but they were essentially what I want to talk about is Cardew going to Abuja and making the Abuja Pottery Center or Research Center, whatever that was called at the time. That was something that Ladi Kwali worked at and became very well known. And you guys have this amazing water pot that is in one of the collections there.
Actually, it's in a New Zealand collection. It's in the National Collection of New Zealand. So it's in the Museum Te Papa. So it came through Peter Stitchbury, who was New Zealand potter who actually worked with Cardew in Africa. Yeah. There is not a Ladi Kwali work in Australia, in an Australian collection, which is terrible.
Okay. Gotcha. Because it is a beautiful pot. And in that, the story of Abuja and that education center is similar and paralleled in some ways to the center that was up close to Darwin, which I'm forgetting the name of now.
Bagot Pottery.
Yeah, Bagot Pottery.
Bagot. Yeah.
Yep. And then later the Tiwi Pottery, which was an indigenous Australian artists working but educated somewhat in a Leach Cardew way. So can you just talk about these ideas of these like educational outposts and what they were and what effect you think they've generated over the years?
Yeah, I just talk briefly about Cardew, and Cardew is a peripheral figure in my book, like not in my book generally, but in my actual book. There isn't a work of his in the book. I think that whole sort of English pottery tradition is something that needs to be a little bit dismantled. And I have actually I purposefully left him out of the book. So it's worth saying that, because I think that Luddy Quali's work, the idea of Cardew going to Africa to teach African people about pottery is laughable. Like, it's actually fun. It's funny. Yeah. Luddy Quali is the great example of that. She was from a tradition that was making amazing vessels. And I think that we emphasize Cardew too much. Actually, we should emphasize Luddy Quali more, because she had agency, and she sort of had the intelligence of actually the thing that Cardew gave her that had value was about firing and actually making it so the pots could have a permanency so that they could travel. And I think she just sees that from Cardew. She's everything in a potter that Cardew could never be. Yeah. And so I think that's why I've included her rather than Cardew. And I have looked at other global histories of ceramics, and I think it's interesting, and I will say it because I think it needs to be said, is Emmanuel Cooper's book that he wrote with the British Museum, A History of Pottery. His section about Africa is an Africa as a continent, which is a collection of countries, so it's not even specific enough to get into countries, but he's writing around Africa is basically about white people working in Africa. It's really bizarre. And that book was revised, and it was written at a time where actually there was plenty of scope to expand those ideas. And so when it came to my book, I was like, well, I don't need to cover that because that's covered elsewhere. I want to emphasize someone like Luddy Quali over those other makers. And so that's what I've done. And I just think that work, that was just before lockdown, I went and saw that work, and it was just so shockingly beautiful and amazing. And I think what's so great about it, and it is something that you need to see, but the sort of robust nature of it and how well made it is, but also this incredible volume inside the pot is just extraordinary. Because quite often I think pottery is about the inside as much as it's about the outside. So it's almost like it's full of all this air. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then the mark making and the drawing is just incredible. So it's almost perfect pottery for me. Like, that's as close to perfection as I think people can get. Yeah. And then to give Cardew his due, he then comes to the Northern Territory and he works with an Australian potter called Ivan McMeekin, who is such a pivotal figure in Australian ceramics history. And McMeekin actually brings Cardew here to go and work in Bagot in the Northern Territory. And they start working with Indigenous artists, but I think Cardew's personality sort of gets in the way of the work there. But I think the artists that he teaches, they actually go on to make incredible things. So the Tiwi pottery being the obvious example. But sadly, a lot of that work, well, not sadly, interestingly, a lot of that work, it's sort of unclear who made who and who decorated what. So the pot that I have in the book, I think Ivan McMeekin made it. And I know that by, again, an incredible thing of actually looking at the object in storage, but being there with Susie McMeekin, who is Ivan's daughter, but also a potter, a great potter in her own right. And she actually picked up that jug and felt the handle and said, that's my dad's pot. Yeah. Which was such a beautiful thing, because it's like, yeah, of course you know, because you know, yeah, it's his hand, it's the way he made it. she could tell, but he made it just through touching the handle. And so in the book it's described as possibly Ivan McMeekin, because you never do know. You can't be 100% certain, but isn't it great that sense of touch, it's still there, like it's fingers, like it's fingertips. You can tell how something is made and who made it. I'm pretty lucky. Like, as a curator, you get to see these objects. Like, you're incredibly privileged and you're incredibly fortunate to be able to do that.
Well, what interested me was the aesthetic similarities. And I mean, a lot of that in terms of form, like that jug is really a British form. Like, that's something that you see.
Oh, yeah, it's medieval.
Yeah, other places in
Yeah.
UK. But the drawing of, I think there's a vertical lizard, which would have been an alligator.
A turtle. It's a turtle.
Oh, turtle. Okay, gotcha. But see, what I'm interested in is the idea that Indigenous artists, who, as you mentioned, like they don't need help with the art. They have art. Like in Australia, the Indigenous art traditions literally go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I've gotten to experience that working at Ernabella Arts, which is, been going since the 40s. But the tradition of painting, or like I've seen cave paintings in that Ernabella region that are so old. So I'm interested in just this idea that you have Cardew and other makers saying, like, we're going to go sort of educate Aboriginal artists or African artists. And then, there's a lot of sort of misplaced pride or hubris in that. But I wonder what they got out of it. I would hope that they're looking at the Indigenous drawings on the pots and going, whoa, look at that. Because that's the thing still today that makes me excited, is looking at Indigenous painting and how that is on those pots.
I've got a feeling, Ben, that Kardew's ego was so big that he just thought, I'm a genius. Yeah. And what I find fascinating, though, about those pots is, like you say, the form is very English. And then Cardew, when you see Kardew's heavy-handedness, I find it interesting because it's problematic in one sense, but it's also this mix of English slipware, Japanese folk art, medieval pottery, and then Africa filtered through the Northern Territory. It's quite strange. Like, again, there's a subject for a book or a PhD, because I think it's just such incredible work. And it's when people like Eddie run off with it, and Eddie and even Ladi Kwali, like, I think they just like took the thing they needed and then they ran with it. Yeah. But all they needed was that simple cue, like, and quite often it's to do with materiality rather than, it's got nothing to do with decoration. It's like all that stuff's sorted. It's about the sort of technical aspects is what I think they needed to sort of get their hands on. And I think they took it and they ran with it.
Well, the last section of the book that I wanted to talk about is the current section, or 2000 up to today. One of the things I noticed is that you have a lot of my friends in there, which actually I was super excited to see. Folks like Natalia Arbelais, I love her work. Like, she's one of my favorite people working. She's a sculptor in the States, and you have a stirrup pot of hers that she's made. In some ways, I feel like picking the modern people is probably the hardest. So how did you pick someone like her, or Dante Hayes, for instance? Like, how did you know about them and include them in the book?
I suppose, well, Instagram is a very amazing tool. But also just, I traveled through the States, I think, about when NSECA was in Minneapolis. So when was that? 2019, just before, was maybe the one before COVID. And I actually met Dante on that trip, and he's one of the most amazing natural artists, a great thinker, just making really incredible work. And it's like, yeah, he's in the book. Like, he was, again, one of those people that it's like, if I'm going to do this book, he's in the book. I will also say that I think it's 95% of the pots in the book are in public collections. But when we get into the contemporary period, there's a few sort of private collections and artist collections, because I think they were artists that I wanted to include, but who don't actually have works in Australian and New Zealand collections. So there's that. But then it's also, with Natalia, there's an earlier stirrup pot in the book. And I think it's quite good to have those instances where you get someone who's deliberately referencing something from much earlier and bringing it into the contemporary, because I mean, she's very much interested in sort of pop culture sort of references as well. So I think she was an artist who, again, sort of someone whose work I really love and whose work I have myself. And I just think, yeah, that sort of chose itself too. But I do think you wanted it to be global, and you also wanted to look at having a really good cultural diversity in the book. Like, I think that's something that some other histories are lacking in. Yeah. So I wanted to have a lot of artists who came from all different sort of cultural backgrounds. I think that's really important. And I think that just gives it a lot of points of access for different types of people. Yeah. But the contemporary part was the trickiest part. And I'm sure there are people who are upset. They're not talking to me about it, but you're going to leave someone out. Yeah. And so that's, I keep saying to people, if you're upset you're not in it, go and buy a few copies of my book so that we can do volume 2, because I'll only do it if this one sells out. So if you want a chance, yeah.
Well, I think that's probably a great place to actually plug the book. Where and how can people get the book?
Well, you can buy it online through thamesandhudson.com.au. So I think if you Google Thames and Hudson ceramics Glenn Barkley, you'll find it. I think that is how people find things, right? And it's available on all the other good book platforms, Amazon, Book Depository, wherever you buy good books. And I think it's in the States. Like, I think it should be in bookshops maybe. Thames and Hudson do have global distribution. So I think it's been brought into the American market, which is really great.
To wrap up, can you leave your Instagram so people could get in touch if they'd like to talk more about what we talked about today?
Yeah, it's Glenn Barkley, one word, GLENNBARKLEY. And then, Ben, I'm going to tell you something amazing that you may not know. So last time we spoke, I said to you that if there was someone out there who wanted to donate some money to an institution, I could help you I could help a museum build a collection. That actually happened.
Whoa.
So Vicky Grimmer, who's used to be the head of the Australian Ceramics Association here in Australia, and Vicky's name's out there, so I'm sure she's happy for me to say it. Vicky actually made a major donation to the Art Gallery of New South Wales to buy Australian contemporary ceramics.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that's from our discussion. That's amazing. Yeah, you probably did not know that.
I did not know that. I'm going to have to email her and thank her for doing that for the good of all, just making the donation.
So if you go to the Art Gallery of New South Wales website and go to their collection page, and if you just typed in Vicky's name, it'd probably bring up all the works that's been purchased. So Peter Cooley, Kirsten Quaylo, Pip Drysdale, Patsy Healy, Steve Harrison. I know I'm going to miss someone. Tony Warburton, like a really amazing group of Australian makers who have been unrepresented in the Art Gallery of New South Wales are now there thanks to Vicky, but also thanks to you.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much for telling me that, because I totally didn't know that.
Yeah. Amazing. If anyone else has got more money, I'm more than happy to help you spend it.
Well, thanks for this today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben.
I'd like to thank Glenn for coming on the show. I certainly appreciate his time, and I really enjoyed the new book, Ceramics: An Atlas of Forms. I'm sure he'll be promoting that a bunch in Australia in the next couple months, and if you're interested in buying it in the U.S., you can pre-order it now on Amazon or through your favorite bookseller. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Michiana Pottery Tour, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you or your organization would like to sponsor an episode of this show or any of the other ones on our network, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, Or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.